Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.
This is MTA International Studios in Silver Spring, Maryland. My name is Ahmed Khan, and I will be moderating today's discussion on Islam Ahmadiyya in America. Our esteemed panelists today are Brother Al-Hajj Habib Shafiq from Orlando and Brother Al-Hajj Yaqub of Milwaukee.
Yes.
Brother Al-Hajj Habib Shafiq served in the education industry. He's as social services professional, social services consultant. He's acquired his master's in public administration. He's worked in city government planning, special projects planning. He's a traveler. He's traveled to Makkah, Medina, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, UK, Ghana. He has a passion for community service and education. In his off time, he loves to cook and garden. Brother Al-Hajj Yaqub served in the military during the Vietnam era. He served as an executive management for proprietary schools, worked in the nonprofit for 10 years, as a quality control in the American Society of Mechanical Engineers as a code inspector. He's a writer, a thinker, and a scholar. In the previous episode, we discussed the pre-Columbus presence of Islam in America. We reached a conclusion there is definitely strong evidence that there was a presence of Islam in America through many different anecdotes. We reached a conclusion that it is beneficial for us to learn about these anecdotes so that we can further do research, because that would be beneficial for us as a community, but as Muslims ourselves. In today's discussion, we will talk about the aspect of Islam during the slavery era of the American history. With that, I would like to ask the first question to Brother Yaqub. When we talk about Islam, Muslims, and slavery in America, what is the picture we get when we read European scholarship? I'm kind of segueing from what we were discussing about European bias. So what kind of picture do we get from that?
Well, much to the credit of the Europeans and European Americans, they're beginning to include a picture of Muslims as being slaves. When I say that, meaning that there were Muslims who were captured and enslaved. And so within the past 20 years, you find that that scholarship has come forward in documentaries on television and books that have been written primarily because African Americans themselves have moved forward into this process of telling the history.
So they're portraying history from just the perspective of slavery, and that's it, and they were slaves.
Yeah, 20 years ago it was just slaves, but now we begin to find out that some of the people who are studying the history of slavery in the United States are getting the narratives of slaves, and in studying the narratives you find out that these people, some of these slaves, were in fact very learned and educated people.
I want to kind of highlight some part of what the slave trade was. So my question is, who were the major players in the slave trade to America?
Well, it was a system, number one. It was a system designed in order to make money. It's as simple as that. And the Europeans, when I say Europeans, meaning the French, the Dutch, the Germans, the British, Portuguese, these were all people who went to West Africa and built forts, and they had the insurance companies designed to insure the cargo. They built all of the chains and the shackles to shackle them in, and they built all of the ships and hired the crews to help facilitate that process, the triangle trade as they call it.
Brother Habib Shafiq, who are these Muslim slaves? Can you describe
these Muslim slaves?
In gist?
This is an extraordinary question. These Muslim slaves were scholars, they were teachers, they were hafizes. Haji has done work on this. They were walking Qurans. These Muslim slaves who were enslaved were not just your regular run-of-the-mill individuals. These were extraordinary scholarly individuals and who resisted with everything that they had, this particular system of slavery.
Some names come to mind. An African prince, Abdul Rahman,
Yes.
whose story is a very unique and interesting story. He came here. He was a hafiz of the
Hafiz,
Quran,
yes.
and his knowledge and scholarship was viewed and understood by the people who were his masters. They even came to affiliate with him on a level that was a connection. So just by what he was in his faith, started to exclude himself by uplifting what they thought who he was.
And these individuals were literate, which, as you know, during the slave trade, teaching a slave to read and write was not only heresy, but if the slave knew how to read and write, that person was killed. And if you were taught, if you were teaching that. So these were extraordinary individuals with extraordinary gifts that Islam gave them.
Coming back to the point from the perspective of Islam, Brother Yaqub, what is the Islamic teachings when it comes to slavery?
Well, as far as slavery is concerned, Islam seeks to eliminate it, in a word, eliminate slavery. So freeing a slave in Islam is a very high moral and spiritual state.
It wasn't like the Emancipation Proclamation where it was just a document where everybody's free now.
No, not at all.
Yeah, it was a step-by-step process.
Yeah, it was a process. I mean, the notion that one day that you were a slave and then the next day you were free is not really consistent with any concepts of justice. So a person really had to be taught a trade or a skill so that they can deal with living in freedom, where they can support their families, they can become educated, etc. So it wasn't like in the Americas where one day they were slaves and the next day Abraham Lincoln did his thing, and then
I mean,
people were
we
free.
can take the best example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, of Hazrat Bilal, radiyallahu anhu. May Allah be pleased with him. In that he became a general, he became a scholar, and he was a former slave.
Right.
So Islam definitely took a process to ending slavery as opposed to one single act.
I would like to mention that when the Westerner studies the process that Islam offers in freeing the slave, they confuse that process with slavery itself.
That's correct.
And that's very important for our audience to grasp that, is that we do not believe that one day that you were a slave for centuries or for decades, and then the next day that you can just be free and be a productive human being in that free society. And when they do study, the Westerner studies it, they look at the process, the step-by-step process, and then they want to attribute that it is Islam that perpetuates slavery.
Speaking of being critical of this process and just understanding it or misunderstanding it,
exactly.
Who is Patricia Origema?
She is an individual that I met online. I engage in debates, religious debates. And one of the debates that I had, or do have, with some of our, what I call Muslim antagonists, is that we are accused of being at the forefront of slavery. And she was one of those who was at the forefront of that. So we engaged in dialogue, and she made several accusations, and I thought it was my responsibility to answer some of these accusations. So,
and the article was very well done in response to it, giving main points of what you just discussed about the teachings of Islam. I want to talk about an aspect that's brought up in the slavery era, and then specifically, they really don't talk about it from the perspective of Islam, but from the perspective of the slaves. And this deals with the slave rebellions. And the question is, what was the background behind the slave rebellions? Very general and in understanding it so we can make a correct conclusion.
Well, we have to keep in mind that rebelling against slavery goes as far back as the Muslims rebelling against slavery in Africa. That these Muslims were learned people. Scholarship is very, very important to the West African expression of Islam. And those people who spent their lives learning the Holy Quran, we may consider them to be the Quran walking.
Yes.
Walking, talking Qurans, knowing the understanding of the teachings of the Quran when it comes to slavery, and that formulated their views that they were, it was a very disingenuous situation.
Absolutely.
Very definitely. And because of the disputes that were going on between different tribes, and they would capture these people and sell them to the Europeans, after a while, these Muslims said we need to wage against slavery.
In their perspective of understanding of Islam.
Exactly.
Now coming back to something that was very subtle, but it's prominent when you study history.
Okay.
And that is the black versus Muslim identity that was being rooted away from each other. So I want to ask, first of all, Brother Habib, what is the Naturalization Act of 1790?
Oh boy.
What did it specifically do?
The Naturalization Act of 1790 was perhaps, it provided the first rules of natural citizenship in the United States. It was very narrow in scope, but it was extraordinarily devious. It had two very narrow stipulations. You had to be free and white and of good character. Therefore, you could not be a slave, you could not be a Native American, indigent servant.
It also talked about the specifying Muslims to be only Arabs and Turks.
Absolutely.
Instead of Africans.
Absolutely.
Who were Muslims that were
It totally was very, very narrow in this, and it lasted a long time into Dred Scott decision, into Plessy versus Ferguson. But this Naturalization Act was the very first legal ruling that defined.
So we can be confident saying that it was a systematic effort to separate the black versus Muslim identity, so that an African cannot be called a Muslim. If he is a Muslim, they'll just label him as a
absolutely.
As a Arab.
Because
or a
remember,
Turk.
there were some Africans who were free, considered free. They were not slaves, but under this act, they were also excluded from having.
So, Brother Yaqub, so going on the question, which is, so there was definitely a systematic effort to separate the Muslim and the black identity, and why was this reason? If you can kind of further
Well, there's a
elaborate.
clear distinction between a Muslim who was captured and put into slavery, as opposed to a individual that was captured. He may be an animus or any other religious identity or not, and put into slavery, because the Muslims had a sense of humanity, they had a sense of justice, they had a sense of who they were. These were scholars, they were doctors, they were the leading people in the community. In fact, the leaders of the civilization in Africa were headed by Muslims.
There is specifically an example, the name Salih Bilali.
Right.
Is notably described the Muslim qualities, and that the Muslims were more intelligent,
Yes.
Reasonable, and dignified.
Yeah.
Right.
So these were the high qualities that were very obvious to not just other slaves.
Right.
In fact, it kind of reverberated that the other slaves were also interested in Islam because of this very reason.
I think it's worth mentioning and noting that the American agriculturalists, they wanted to secure slaves from a certain region who had certain skills. They may have skills to cultivate rice, as an example. And so they went to certain regions in West Africa to secure these people and brought them over here and planted them in areas where they wanted to grow rice, because before cotton was king, rice was king.
Mm-hmm.
So, and these people that they got from the Senegambia area, if they were not in fact Muslims, they definitely were living in what we may consider to be Muslim lands. So there may be entire groups of people
Yes.
that they brought over here to the Americas who were Muslims, and for specific reasons.
Brother Ahmed, worth noting, we know in Islam that the best among you is he who learns Quran, the best among you who is most knowledgeable. Those Africans who were knowledgeable of Islam were very honored among their people and among their regions. And because of that particular aspect of Islam, they too were very valuable, not only to the slave trade, but also to their people, and had this esteem. So it is Islam who gave that particular note to them.
I also want to now jump to another
Sure.
point in the same time frame.
Sure.
Specifically, we're talking about the founding fathers.
Yes.
What was the perspective of Islam when it came to the founding fathers that we don't want to misunderstand?
Yes. I'm a proud American. But in my view, and as a retired teacher of U.S. history, in my view, it was an idealism. It was an idealism that they aspired for, but it
Talking
was
about high-minded.
high-minded. It was extraordinarily high-minded idealism, but it was not rooted in fact.
Just to give you some examples of this high-minded idealism is Thomas Jefferson, who created the Virginia Statute for Freedom.
Okay.
And in it, he mentioned specifically including Muslims by the name of Mahometans.
Yes.
And then also...
And he owned the Holy Quran.
And he owned the Holy Quran. He actually took a great deal of effort to learn Arabic.
Yes.
As well, to understand the Quran himself in the original language. And then Benjamin Franklin said that both house and ground were nested in trustees expressly for the use of any preacher of any religious persuasion who might desire to say something to the people
Yes.
in Philadelphia.
Yes.
The design and building not being accommodate any particular sect, but the inhabitants in general, so that even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send a missionary to preach Mohammedanism to us, he would find a pulpit here.
And then it belies these words: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are bound by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. We hold these men to be... This did not apply to those slaves. This did not apply.
It seems like what
So
you're
to
talking
me,
about
it's
is high-minded
high-mindedness.
idealism.
It's high-minded idealism in my
That we
view.
want to
Yes.
achieve something like this, but we can't
Yes.
get to it right now.
Absolutely, yes.
The final question, Brother Yaqub, that I want to get to is was there a systematic effort to suppress the propagation of Islam in America? So we've talked the racial part of it, but was there a systematic effort to suppress the propagation of Islam in America at this time? We have to understand there were 30% Muslims estimated, on an estimated basis,
Right.
at that time. That's a great deal of the population
Quite
that could affect the propagation of Islam if they were to give in free reign.
Quite.
And if you kind of mention why were slave codes used in stopping these, for instance, they couldn't hold a gathering for
Yes.
more than 3 people.
Right. Well, very definitely, there was a systemic effort to suppress learning, and that was a key feature among Muslims from West Africa. Is scholarship was very, very important to them.
Absolutely.
So there were laws that were initiated during the slave trade in the Americas, where you were a slave was prohibited to learn how to read, learn how to write, and if you were a Muslim, you knew these things. You had to keep it hidden. It wasn't something that you advertised.
So they knew.
They knew.
They knew that they couldn't do that. They were very well aware of the laws that were being created around them, such as the slave codes or the non-congregational law.
Right.
Just
I think there's something else also.
Just to go off of that, what were they afraid of?
Well,
the people who were creating these laws.
They were afraid of losing control. You're looking at the number of slaves that were in the Americas outnumbered the people who were the slave holders.
And that's very significant.
So, and we're looking at a business.
And that's a very good point, because numbers sometimes outweigh the successes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, whatever could be done in order to keep slaves slaves. The idea was never to have a slave and then work towards their emancipation. That was not a concept.
Now I can understand the idea of why they were trying to separate the Muslim and the black identity.
Very definitely.
Unless there's been some documentation too, Haji, you can speak more onto this. There have been some documentation that there were slaves who kept records for their slave owners in Arabic.
Oh yeah, definitely. There were these slaves that their owners knew who they were. When I say who they were, they knew their level of intelligence. They knew their abilities. These people were overseers or managers, and the slave master.
In fact, like if they found out that, for instance, he's a Muslim and they had the qualities of being literate and stuff like that, they would manage like 1,000 slaves in one instance.
They were the managers.
Doing the work that the other persons.
Our very first president, George Washington, was a slave owner, and if you visit Mount Vernon, George Washington, in his spare time, he tinkered and he invented, and he had some very high-tech things for the times in his home, and his home and these things were built by slave artisans. Now, I mean, there were no apprenticeship schools.
Thomas Jefferson was only able to free 10 of his slaves out of 100, for whatever reason.
Yeah.
So they had that. That mindset.
Yes.
They couldn't take away from that.
Yes.
Even the high-minded idealism was not for the specifics of changing their own behavior. It was to build, according to them, try to build something better than what they had before, which was coming from a monarchical structure.
Yes.
So I think with this conclusion tells us, this discussion tells us, and the conclusion that we can make from this discussion is that first of all, there was a systematic effort to separate the Muslim versus black identity.
Yes. And
they did that through law, and they did that through their behavior when going down to the level of the master and the slave.
And the motivation was controlled.
They wanted to forget who they were, and they did not want the African slave to be following a superior ideology or superior philosophy according to what their understanding was. And they knew that it was.
Right.
It was pretty obvious, according to the information that we have. And then the second thing was, that we can agree on, is that there was a systematic effort to suppress the propagation of Islam. And the first one was actually a factor in creating that suppression of the faith in the second part of it, the propagation of Islam in America. Because going back to what we said, that if the 30% were allowed to be free to do whatever they want, it would have completely changed the landscape of the American society.
And they knew that endemic in the Holy Prophet's teachings was seeking knowledge and sharing that knowledge.
So in this discussion, we've discussed very important points of the Islam and slavery era.
Yes.
And I think this will definitely segue into our next episode, which will be discussing the revival of Islam in America.
We look forward to it.
And this concludes our discussion for Today in Islam, Ahmadiyya in America, and we will continue our next episode 3, where we will focus on the revival of Islam in America. Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.